In this presentation, we will take a look at part 2 of our C Corporation comprehensive problem, this time looking at our Excel worksheet, taking the data that we would be receiving from our accounting system or our client, and then inputting that into our Excel worksheet, which we will then use to populate the actual form, the 1120. Here is our form 1120. Now, typically, we're not just going to take the financial statements and populate them directly into the form 1120, because usually the 1120 is going to be more of a complex return, and we will typically benefit then by taking that information, taking those financial statements and populating them into some type of worksheet. I think Excel is a great tool, probably the best tool in my opinion, to put this information into so that you can then work with it and track the information as you put it into the system. I would also, as you work forward, have an open items list that would be handy. I would put it either next to you. It might have just a notepad. The open items list is not designed to be given to anyone else except possibly a supervisor or something like that. And even then, you might want to clean it up. I would have it here just to jot down everything that comes forward as you work through the problem. Many things we will do within the problem is we're just going to push forward and go through one step at a time. And therefore, when we skip things, when we're not looking at a certain point, we want to jot that down or indicate it in some way because we are planning, of course, to go back to it. Note that we will be doing this data entry process quickly. So if it's too fast for you and you don't want to learn all the Excel stuff and you want to get to the tax return, don't worry, because the next step that we will go to, we'll have a pre-formatted worksheet. We'll have a new sheet each step along the way. And you could just go to that worksheet, which will already be pre-formatted, and take a look at the next step without having to do this full process. But it's really useful to be able to do this process. All right, so we have our financial statements on the left. This is what we would be getting from the client or from our software. We're going to be inputting that into our trial balance on the right, converting from a plus and minus format to a debit and credit format, kind of the opposite that you would do if you were to make the financial statements, where you would typically be taking the trial balance and then converting it into the plus and minus financial statements. To do that, we're going to hide some cells to make this as easy on the eyes as possible. We're going to be hiding column G, so I'm going to put my cursor on column G. I'm going to select over to column L, G to L, let go of the selected area and right click on the selected area and then hide. So now we've got this side by side, which is nice. Now I want to remove the prior year because we're only going to be using the current year. We're going to be starting with the balance sheet first, and I don't want to get confused because I always do and I don't like it. So I'm going to put my cursor on B, going to be dragging over to C, let go, right click that selected area and hide them. All right, so now there's the least amount of mistakes I can make here, and I'll still find a way, but we're going to start here. Now note we have the headers up top aren't what we're going to be including on this side. We're just going to be including the accounts. That's why it's going to be a more simplified. That's what's going to make it a bit easier to do. We're going to be representing the debits with positive numbers, the credits with negative numbers here, rather than having two columns for each of these sections. If we were to have two columns for each section, this thing would be 10 columns long instead of 5 columns long, and it's already confusing enough. We don't need another, 5 columns. Also, when we look at the calculations, as we will see, it'll really be a lot easier if you format the calculations in this way. In other words, if you format debits positive, credits negative, and we calculate things like net income or total assets, be a lot faster, a lot easier to do. Let's see that as we go. So have some faith with us as we start this out, and hopefully you'll agree with that as you go along. Also note that if you're working at a CPA firm or an accounting firm or tax firm, they may have other types of software that they use or other type of methods. And remember that what your goal to do is to try to go with what they're using as much as possible. You don't want to deviate from their system, copy what happened last year basically within the system. But then of course there might be shortcuts and things, and you've got to expand to it to the degree that you can understand what's going on. So you need to find some kind of balance. If you're able to create your own kind of thing, I think this is the way to go with it in terms of the worksheet. So I'm going to scroll back over. I'm going to pick up the cash. We're then going to use the autofill to drag it down. Now, you could copy and paste it. I'm going to be using the autofill and formulas as much as possible. I recommend doing that because it's best practice to use a formula whenever possible. I'm going to put my cursor here, and then we're going to put our cursor on that fill handle. I'm going to drag it down, and it'll actually populate even the words. Now, note if I go too far, it's not a problem. If I go too far, I just say, now I want to stop there. There's the total. I don't want the total, so I'm just going to highlight those two. I'm going to delete them. So there we have it. Now, these are debit balance accounts because they're assets, and assets have debit balances. Therefore, all I need to do is pick up the same number. I'm going to use the equal sign, pick up the number over here and enter. Then I'll use the trusty autofill once again, put in our cursor back on it, put our cursor on the autofill handle, drag it on down with the left click, auto drags it down, Dr. Phil does the calculations. That's why it's called autofill. Not really, but that's why I call it autofill. Now note it put a negative here. That negative here represents a credit balance. The negative over here represents a negative number. In other words, this is in plus and minus numbers, positive assets minus the negative number that's going to be bringing down the assets. Over here, positives are the debits, and then the credit's going to bring down the debit balance, normal balance type accounts. Note how easy it is to see if we got it in there correctly. If we can just highlight them, we don't have to pull out a calculator even or try to add it up in our head. There's the number 4368601. That ties up to the subtotal right there, so we can check it very easily. You can't do that so easily if it had a debit and credit column. We're then going to go down below and we're going to be picking up the next number, equals. And I'm skipping the subtotals. I'm just picking up the actual number or the data or the accounts. And I'm going to autofill one account down. So we need the next account below it. So I'm going to autofill one account down, autofill handle, drag down. Going to do the same to the numbers, equals. We're going to pull over that 1,065,000 and enter. We're going to autofill that down, putting our cursor back on it, put our cursor on the fill handle once again, left click and drag down. Once again, I'm not going to be picking up the subtotal here, which is the 1,144,000. I can check if it's correct by highlighting those two. It does the subtraction for us, given the debit and credit. Debit's positive, credit's negative to the 1,144,899 checked down below. Next, I'm going to be pulling over the land, equals the land, and I'm going to just pull over the land, which is going to be equaling that 600,000. Then I'm going to be skipping this subtotal, which is the property, plants, and equipment. I could check that subtotal if I was to highlight these three numbers, and I see that it should be, according to my trial balance, 1,744,899, which is indeed what the subtotal is here. So I'm feeling pretty confident that we're doing things as they should be done. Then I'm going to be picking up the other assets, so there they are. And we pick up the other assets. All right, and now we can check the total assets and see if they are indeed correct. And I'm going to highlight the whole thing now, debits minus the credits. It's going to do the subtraction for us when needed. There's the 6,283,500 matching up to 2,683,500. So we're looking good so far. Everything matches out. We're going to be going down now to the liabilities. Equals, scrolling down, we're going to skip all these subtotals and whatnot, and we're going to go down on the headers and all that kind of stuff to the accounts payable. Enter. Now the accounts payable is a liability account. Liability accounts have credit balances. Therefore, I need a credit here, which I'm going to represent with a negative number. Instead of hitting equals, the way I'm going to do that is say negative instead of equals. And then scroll on down and pick up that 270 and enter. Now, if you go back on it, note what happens. You get an equal sign and then the negative. It's just faster to put the negative first. All you're saying is basically Excel, take that number and change the sign, flip it, in essence, multiply it times -1. I'm going to autofill that down one space. So I'm going to put my cursor on the fill handle, autofill that down. We're going to do that over here as well. We're going to put our cursor on the fill handle and autofill that down. Then we're going to go on to the next item, equals. We're down here now. Where are we at? We're down to the notes payable. I'm going to hit enter, then autofill to the other liabilities. So enter, put my cursor back on it, fill handle, left click, drag down, other liabilities. Then we're going to pick up the number, not equals, but negative, because I want to take that number and flip the sign, dragging over or scrolling down to the 690,000, enter, putting my cursor back on that number and putting my cursor on the autofill handle, left clicking and dragging down. Then we're going to see what else we have down here. I think that brings us down to the equity section. Now, if we want to double check the liabilities and see that they are correct, we can highlight them. They're going to be showing as negative numbers here, but that's because they're credits. That's okay. Don't let that throw you off. The balance is 1,232,000. That adds up to the balance here, so we're pretty confident that the liabilities are as they should be. Now we're in the equity section. Equity section, we're going to have the capital account and the retained earnings. So I'm going to pick those up. We're going to start with the account names, equals. We're going to scroll on down, picking up those account names. Capital account, put my cursor back on it using the old autofill and dragging down. I can't do it. There we go. It was being stubborn. Now, this needs to be a credit account. So once again, I'm going to use not the equals, but the negative. And that's going to take that 500,000. It's going to be flipping the sign, giving it the negative 500,000. We could then autofill that down if we so choose. And I am choosing to do so. And so there we have that. Now, if we were to highlight the entire thing, if I was going to say, all right, let's highlight this entire thing and see what happens, it adds up to 0. And that would make sense because what that means is that the debits equal the credits. So debits equal the credits in the balance sheet, or in other words, if we take the total assets, I can highlight the total assets, which go down to here, 6,283,500, and then if I highlight the liabilities and the equity, comes out to 6,283,500, those being the same. That's what's supposed to happen when the balance thing is balancing. So now what I want to do is note that this is the most difficult part of the trial balance. The retained earnings is the most difficult part of the trial balance because really the trial balance is going to have the whole income statement broken out. So the retained earnings is really going to be the beginning retained earnings minus any dividends if there are any. So we'll get back to retained earnings. Right now I'm just going to note that that's wrong in terms of the trial balance, delete it, highlight it. I'm going to make it yellow over here. I'm going to say I'm going to come back to that and figure that out later. I'm also going to make these two items blue because this is the equity section and that's like the middle of the trial balance. In other words, anything above the blue line now I see as the balance sheet, or it is the balance sheet, and that's how I see it. And then down below that line is the income statement, which we will construct now. So now let's scroll down to the income statement and see what we have down there. So if we look at the income statement, I've hidden the numbers. We have to unhide the numbers now. So the numbers are hidden between column A and D. So I'm going to put my cursor on column A, left click and drag over to column D, let go, right click on the selected area and unhide those cells. And there's the numbers. That's good. Now we have the sales over here. That's where we're going to start. Sales is our revenue account. Sales, now this is kind of confusing because sales is a credit balance account, right? So sales are credits, so we're going to represent it up here with a negative number. Not because it's negative sales, but because it's a credit balance account. So I'm going to say equals, and we're going to scroll back down. We're going to be picking up that sales number. Like the liabilities, instead of hitting equals, I'm going to say negative in order to take that number for sales and flip the sign with it. So we're going to pick up that 4,120,000 and flip the sign to a negative 4,120,000, representing a credit to the sales. Under that, we're going to have the allowances. Now, this is like a contra sales account. So it's a contra sales account, which basically is like a sales account, but it has a debit balance, or it's in the sales section with a debit balance, kind of like contra asset account, like depreciation or accumulated depreciation, I should say. So therefore, this acts like an expense. In other words, it's going to be a debit balance account. So we're going to say equals debit balance account. Next one is cost of goods sold. I'm going to say equals. We're going to scroll on down to the cost of goods sold. Notice we're not picking up the net sales, which is basically the net of the first two. So I'm going to pick up the cost of goods sold. If we want to check the net sales, I can highlight these two and check that subtotal, which should be the 4,090,000. There's the 4,090,000. So that kind of checks out. It does check out. Totally checks out. So then we're going to be on N23. I'm going to say equals. This is going to be an expense, therefore have a debit balance. We're going to say equals and scroll on down to the cost of goods sold, 900,000. And then after the cost of goods sold, we have another subtotal down here. And then we're going to have the income accounts. So these income accounts, we're going to pick those up. That's going to be fun. So we're going to put our cursor on M24 equals, and we're going to scroll on down and pick up the capital gains. I'm going to say enter, and then I'm going to pick up those other 3 or 4 items. I don't really care if it's 3 or 4 because I'm just going to auto-fill down. And if I go too far, that's okay because I can just see those subtotals. I don't need those two. I'm going to delete those. These are income accounts, and therefore they're going to have a credit balance rather than a debit balance. Therefore, we're going to have a negative rather than an equals, and then scroll down and pick those up. So we're looking for the capital gains. There's the capital gains. There it is, picking that one up. Going to put my cursor back on that cell. We're going to use the trusty autofill handle, left click, dragging down. So there we have that. What do we got next? What's next? We've got the expenses. Now this is going to be the long category. This is where the autofill really earns its keep right here. So we're going to pick up the wages, then we're going to autofill all the way down. So I'm going to scroll back up. We're going to say equals. Scroll on down. We're going to pick up the wages. Enter. Now notice you could pick up the numbers at the same time. It might be faster. Like if I said equals and I pick up the number too of the 1,100,000 and then enter, and then I'm going to highlight both of those cells and autofill the 2 columns at the same time. So we highlight both of those. I'm going to put my cursor on the autofill handle, and I'm going to left click and drag down. Now again, I don't know how many cells are there. If I go too far, that's okay because I'll see the subtotals and I'll simply delete them. So I went too far. There's the subtotal. Going to delete it. stops at the miscellaneous. So those are all of our expenses. Now note as we did this, it fits perfectly because this is kind of a practice problem. If you had a worksheet that you were making, then you might have to add some cells into this. In order to add cells, the easiest way to do that, you don't want to highlight the whole column. What you want to do is highlight just what you need. I'm going to highlight basically to here because what's going to happen is you can imagine these cells pushing down, and I don't want it to mess anything up on the right or mess anything up on the left. I don't want it to mess anything up, below it. So I'm going to make sure to pick up this number that seems to be included, right click on it, and then don't do this, by the way, because I'm going to delete it anyway, just showing you if you need a cell, and then insert. And then you want to shift the cells down, and that's how you would shift them down. So that's how you would add cells. You can add more than one cell that way. If you had to add multiple cells, you can highlight multiple cells, and then, you want to do it out to here, basically. I'm going to undo this, so don't do this. So I'm going to say insert, and then shift them down. So that's how you'd manipulate the sheet if you needed more room. Okay, so there we have that. Now I'm going to scroll back on over to the right. There's one more account we need to pick up. That's why that empty slot is there, and that's going to be the federal income tax. Federal income tax, so we're going to scroll back up to pick that up, and we're going to be here. I'm going to say equals. I'm going to pick up that federal income tax. There it is. And that's going to also be a debit balance account. That's an expense type of account, so we'll pick up the 260 in the expense. Now we can double check the income statement, which is where we're most likely to be off because the income statement has the most accounts, all those expense accounts. So if I highlight them and it's good, then we're pretty happy. We're doing good. So that adds up to the 1,461,500. And if we scroll down here, 1,461,500. Now if it didn't add up, we can highlight things like each section, like the expense section was here, and you'll remember it didn't include that 260, and I could say, okay, that one's at 1,505,000, and say there's the 1,505,000, right? And most of the time when people are off and they're learning this system, it's because they have a debit going the wrong way or a credit going the wrong way. So they have their signs wrong. So to check that, for example, if I had this sign, this wouldn't be one that would typically be wrong, but if this was wrong, then you'd be off by basically twice that amount. If I check my net income, I'll be off by twice that amount. In other words, if I check all these numbers and I was to say, okay, that adds up to 1,475,500. Here's the 1,475,500, and it should be this number. So what's the difference between them? 14, and if you take whatever the difference is and divide it by 2, then you're going to say, oh, 7,000. Is there something 7,000? And then you're going to say, that one's going the wrong way. I'm going to make it go that way, and then it should fix it. So that's one common way that you can kind of look to fix those problems. Okay, so now we're going to go back up top, and you'll recall we left this retained earnings in place. We're not in balance. We have to figure out this retained earnings. Now the retained earnings represents, notice that we have the net income down here, so the retained earnings should be the beginning balance, and then you have to take into consideration if there's going to be any dividends. That's how it would be, because notice the retained earnings calculation would be the beginning balance, which should be on the prior year financial statement, so that should be in the prior year financial statement, retained earnings, and then it's going to go up by the net income. There's the net income. Let's say net should go up by net income, and that's going to be equal to what's on the income statement. And notice we have that reflected already because that's all these numbers down here. That's the net income right here. Okay, and so what we're not, and so you would think then that maybe this would be the beginning balance to get you to the ending retained earnings, right? The ending retained earnings, you would think, well, then maybe this is just the beginning balance, and I could say it would be negative because it's a credit balance of the beginning retained earnings. And you would say, all right, cross your fingers and hope that that puts you in balance, but it didn't. It didn't put you in balance. So what could it be off by? Well, then we would look into the retained earnings account, to the GL account, to see if there's any activity. And typically, because usually the retained earnings only has the activity that rolls over net income into retained earnings each year. And net income is broken out down below. So there could be something else, and that would be dividends. So in our case, we're going to look in there and say, yeah, there's dividends. So then dividends are like draws, so they're money going out to the owners. So they would be decreasing. So then the ending retained earnings, you would think, if you include dividends, would be the 455,1,500. So that's what it matches here, 455,100. But in our balance here, what we need to do is pick up this amount plus, which is going to subtract the dividends. So this includes the beginning balance and the dividends that were posted to the retained earnings, and then everything below is net income. Therefore, if I highlight this whole thing, I'm picking up the beginning balance plus or minus dividends plus the net income. That comes up to the 455,1,500, which is the 455,1,500 here and the 455,1,500 here. Now, all we're going to do to finish this, next thing we need to do is take a look at the net income, how easy it is to calculate net income. I'm going to delete this formula and say this equals the sum, and I'm going to pick up the net income, which is going to be everything below the blue accounts. I'm just going to sum up the whole thing below the blue accounts and enter. So there we have that. And the net income is going to be the same all the way across. So I'm going to have the differences here. There's nothing there yet, but I'm going to go all the way across to here. And then I'm going to change it for the tax side. So for the tax element, I'm going to double click on it. And I want to not include any of the colored areas, any of the, the green and blue and whatnot. So I'm going to remove these items. And that's going to be our difference that's going to be represented by those M1 adjustments mainly. So that's going to be our adjustment. Next thing we want to do is to do our formulas here. So I'm going to add our adjusted trial balance is going to be this cell plus this cell. And then that's where we'll enter our adjustments. So I'm just going to use the trusty sum function and select those two cells and enter. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to take this cell plus this cell equals the trusty sum function, those two cells. And then I'm going to highlight both of those and use our autofill and select those all the way down. So I'm just going to take those all the way down with our autofill. And there's going to be our calculation there. Now, if that was too fast for you to build, we're going to have the worksheet step by step with which each step along the way, so that you don't, if that was too much to do at one time, you'll have a pre-formatted worksheet as we go through each step after this point.